Welcome to today's webinar entitled 3 Mistakes That Disrupt Succession Planning. Developing formal succession management program is a top concern among organizations according to Burson by Deloitte, PwC, and many more. Today I'm going to discuss how to better develop the talent pipeline and ensure leaders are ready for future roles. I'm Linda Janak. I'm the CEO of Talent Guard. We are a full-service, competency-based talent management software company, and I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with me today to learn more about this topic. What is succession planning? There are a lot of definitions, and I prefer the definition by Burson. And that is that succession planning is a systematic process that organizations use to identify and develop talent for critical roles. Although pundits advise companies to engage in succession planning to improve business outcomes, very few companies actually do it. As a matter of fact, Burson by Deloitte estimates that 21% of companies have no succession plan. These companies are limited in growth and business flexibility due to a lack of managerial and leadership skills. In this slide here, over in the red, you can see it says level 1, and they call it fragmented replacement planning. Companies at this level have identified a list of senior level executives. They have identified a potential list of high potentials, yet they do very little to no targeted development. Level 2 in the yellow represents the largest segment of companies at 52%. In this category, companies are following basic formal processes, so they are doing talent reviews. They have some development plans. However, there is much room for improvement because it's being pushed up the ranks from HR. And a very small portion of companies represent the last two: integrated succession management and transparent talent mobility. These levels focus typically on corporate-wide succession planning at many job levels in a company. So why do succession planning? Why should companies engage in the process at all? Well, without a formal succession plan, companies risk losing top talent, disrupting business plans, and they minimize leadership gaps for key positions. Succession planning, it really should be a normal business practice for several reasons. First and foremost, business continuity. Even the best management teams can't predict the future. So it's best to prepare contingencies ahead of potential disaster. Whether an executive decides to suddenly retire, illness strikes, economic conditions change, a formal succession plan can help alleviate risk and stress during these times of change. Second, a proven leadership model. Aspiring leaders today face more challenges than ever before building and sustaining their companies. They must reconcile their own personal results and achievement with that of accountability for organizational outcomes. Organizations must train and mentor leaders to balance their own personal development with more concrete factors, such as mitigating corporate risk. So formal succession planning can help bridge the gap between organizational strategy and an individual's personal career development needs. Improving engagement. Planning for the future can inspire management and employees to remain engaged. Embracing the future through systematic planning is key to survival. With the right processes in place to ensure objectivity and continuous improvement, everybody wins. And finally, minimizing risk. Many risks can be minimized, such as an untimely departure of a critical employee, risk of retirees taking their experience and knowledge with them to some other company, not retaining the collective IQ of important teams, and risk of losing high performers to our competitors. And financial improvements. Companies can experience tremendous financial improvement with the right succession plan in place. Some of these could include saving on recruitment costs for replacement hires and costs associated with onboarding new employees. We know that takes tremendous effort, only to see them leave 9 months to a year and a half later. So, what positions should companies plan for? And we hear a lot about C-suite planning and the highest level executives. Most companies do focus on succession planning at the executive ranks, as demonstrated here in this SHRM poll. However, best practice organizations are now trying to address succession management across all key positions, spanning all levels, including technical, specialized, and individual contributor roles. Companies like Tokyo Electron that I've worked with have expert engineers who have to train for years to be extremely competent on certain types of machinery and or the supply chain process. MD Anderson Cancer Center is another example. They're highly dependent on expert researchers who have to attend university and many years after that training to perfect their specialty and then contribute that to future endeavors. It's very hard to replicate. So identifying the right successors depends solely on knowing which positions are most critical to your organization, which leads us to mistake number 1, the identification of key positions. The foundation of succession planning involves identifying critical positions. You must identify these roles to effectively meet business objectives now and in the future. So, how do we go about identifying these positions and then setting priorities on them? If you are just getting started with succession planning, my recommendation is to form a cross-functional succession planning committee to discuss and debate several questions as a starting point. Let's take a look at what some of these questions might be. Which positions are most critical in achieving current and future goals? Which positions, if left vacant, could cause harm to an organization? Which positions require specialized skills or knowledge, as in the example of Tokyo Electron and MD Anderson? Which ones have been hard to recruit for? It's either taking a long time, or we just can't find anybody, or we have to relocate people in from other parts of the country. And do projected labor shortages exist for the skills that you need in the future? These questions may seem simple to ask, but they are not easily answered because each person on that committee will have their own agenda, their own priorities, and their own biases. With this in mind, how do we get the best answers possible to these important questions? Well, you need to develop selection characteristics. It's important to identify a set of formal job characteristics that serve as the basis for identifying critical roles. For example, scope of authority. This would describe the breadth and the depth of the critical roles being discussed. And the goal is to determine the extent each particular role could have positively or negatively on the organization. What might the primary detriment be? This would be the identification of impediments that could derail the role. For example, the CTO role of a cloud-based company that hosts with a third-party provider could get derailed if the third-party provider suddenly had a takedown of its internet, of its hosting environment. That would not be the CTO's fault, but it could deter somebody within that role. What about the effect on value creation? That would be the extent that the role creates short-term and long-term stakeholder value. The greater the impact, the more important the role. The consequences of mistakes. Of course, mistakes are inevitable, but the goal here is to identify those mistakes that could cripple an organization. For example, in a manufacturing company, if they don't get the exact specifications right on, say, a big piece of equipment, that could have a massive negative impact on a customer, its revenue, and the customer's time to market. So that would not be good for either the company creating it or the company receiving it. And then finally, the consequence of the wrong person. Well, we've all made hiring mistakes, some more than others, but let's imagine hiring a chief revenue officer of a public company. They might have a more severe consequence on the bottom line than that of a private company. For obvious reasons, a public company has to report on a quarterly basis, whereas a private company doesn't have the requirement to do that. Now, there can be many more characteristics, but I'm just giving you an idea for the types of things that your committee should think about in determining the criteria to select the roles for your environment. Now, once we have those basic defining characteristics, which are outlined here in the blue, and they are agreed upon by all participants involved in the succession planning process, you can now begin to put some definition around each of those areas. I typically refer to this as characteristic qualifiers. What are those things we're going to use as levers to say whether or not one person fits in our category or not? In my example, I've organized these critical positions into 3 basic groups. My first group being strategic, and I'm calling them my A positions. My second group being specialized skills, my B position. And my final position, hard to fill, and I'm labeling these as my C position. The more specific the qualifiers, the less argument you will have among the team about what roles are critical or not. My recommendation is to ensure that all of your qualifiers are specific and measurable. In my example, I'm not getting very specific in all of them because I'm just giving you an example. However, let's take a look at one example under scope of authority. The person in this role or this role would have strategic impact that could result in missing revenue targets by as much as $10 million. That is pretty quantifiable, and that's a pretty large sum for most organizations. So the question would be, well, does this role, the role that we're thinking about, have that level of impact? If not, well, does it fit into a B position or a C position, or does it fit at all within these criteria? Now, I'm just going to break this down a little bit more. Once those qualifiers are set and we're evaluating each of them, I always like that the whole team agrees on which positions fit and which ones do not. But one thing to think about is whether you have to meet all of the criteria on your list or some of the criteria. Now, I've seen both scenarios and there's no right answer. It is unique to each organization, but make sure that you have agreement on the rules of engagement with your whole team. So for the A positions, you can see here in my particular example, most of them are senior leadership positions, except for the chief scientist, which is an individual contributor role. Many of them are management positions as well. So it's not always going to end up that way for your company, but in this particular scenario, that's what happened here. For the B positions, you can see several individual professional and or technical positions exist on my list, such as a product designer and a supply chain owner. That's just because of the impact based on my criteria here. And the same holds true for those in my hard to fill positions. These hard to fill for us were typically those roles that turn over a lot and or in the case of the compliance specialist, were really hard to find because we needed a specific skill set. So either we had to find them, which took a long time, or we had to train them, which could also take a long time. Now, once we've identified our critical roles and our criteria, what's next? Well, the next step, involves creating your job role profiles. Now, a study by consultancy Hay Group revealed some incredible findings. And you can see on the left here, no role profiles or poorly written job descriptions were used as the majority of the companies that we've been working with as their basis for succession planning, which is not the right thing. So in the Hay findings, 51% of HR managers believe that poor descriptions can mislead employee expectations, and this ultimately drives them to leave. That is not a good thing. 68% said that poor job descriptions contributed to weak candidate pools, and I can see why. You think you're being hired for one thing, and it's really for something else. And then 86% agreed that good job profiles led to better and higher quality candidates that ended up staying longer. However, the problem is that nearly half of all respondents agreed that their HR department and/or managers are doing a poor job of writing these job profiles. And really, that sets the wrong expectations for employees from day one. In addition, the time it takes to write a great job role profile takes a minimum of 5 to 6 hours. And HR people and managers are already limited in their daily schedules. So finding the time to write those is difficult. So what does a successful job role profile include? Well, it includes a description, a job title, competencies, both soft and functionally oriented, experience expectations, qualifications, and I say work style preferences. So if a job profile can help a company attract better candidates and ultimately make the company more competitive, but they take countless hours to create, then what's the best method for creating role profiles? Well, the build or buy decision is rarely binary. Many options exist to help you create industry best practice job role profiles. So let's explore some of the pros and cons of the 3 options I've laid out here. If it's all or in-house, typically the HR organization and or an HR organization with a committee, they're going to build every single job role profile. Now, for organizations that have or compete on a lot of IP and require talent with specific role profiles, that will give you a better ability to protect your competitive advantage because you have total control over the role profiles and you can build exactly what your business needs. However, you're responsible for managing all of the updates. Now, if you have 700 to 1,000 profiles, that's a lot of dedicated time. And you're also going to train time to market for those roles. So whether you're using them in your recruiting process, your onboarding process, your performance review, your career pathing, all of your talent processes, it's going to take you a lot of time to get there, to have all of those complete. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Or you can choose to have part built by you and part outsourced. So you would potentially buy a soft skills competency database by a third party and then build out all of your technical and experience components. So that can give you a balance, and it gives you both the ability to have some internal control, but it improves your time to market with those role profiles. So you don't have to wait, a year or 2 to start using them. Or the final option is you buy a job role profile database. Now, you're not going to be able to buy all the job role profiles from one vendor. You may have to use multiple vendors or multiple associations, which can take time to find. However, They typically have vetted those roles across multiple different industries and multiple different companies. You get to minimize the time it takes to get your roles ready by just doing slight updates, changing words to meet your culture and your vernacular. And you can use them immediately once you have them. You don't have to wait for them to be developed. And you can have some of that vendor support because they're constantly updating theirs and you get to benefit from that. So let's just spend a minute looking at the time and cost of building your own versus kind of outsourcing. What we've seen, and we've worked with many companies who wanted to build their own, and it took them on average for 700 job role profiles about 18 to 24 months to build out all of the areas that we said were recommended. Now, that is about 2.5 to 4 man years, not full years, but man years. And that probably equates to about 4,200 hours. If you're averaging, it takes 6 hours to create each profile. So Talent Guard out of the box, and we've done a lot of aggregation across multiple vendors to aggregate these job roles and fine-tune them over time so that you can use them immediately. And with that in mind, it usually takes the customer 4 to 6 weeks to fine-tune 700 profiles to meet their specific needs. And that is really about 350 hours of our time and your time, so that you can start using them immediately with the launch of your talent management initiatives. So really think about your company and what might work best for you. Our recommendation is that you can drastically reduce time to market and cost by using something quote unquote out of the box. So what might a job role profile look like for your organization? And I'd like to share that with you. And I'm going to just jump here real quick. Oh, did it open? Right here. And I'm going to move that so you can see. Okay, so a job role profile, as you can see here, for the human resource manager job, typically has a title. It belongs to a group. It has a basic description. It outlines the responsibilities here. You can see key responsibilities. It has some attributes, which we call qualifiers. And it's going to have some general competencies, as I said in this example. We have many. Analytical thinking has a description, has one of our key skills, and then it has basic indicators. In addition, you can see it here, it has a level. So an HR manager should be operating at a level 3 for analytical thinking, and these are the things that I should be able to quantify and qualify as I am looking at them either in performance or succession. So there are going to be several general competencies and several technical competencies. Now, technical competencies, as I said, are role dependent. So for HR, you're going to see things like change management, compensation and benefits, employee relations, and the such. Now, in addition to that, what we typically look at is client-focused, as an example, typically has 5 levels. That's how we operate. And we saw a lot that the HR person, HR manager, was typically right in the middle. For some, level 2 for others, maybe moving into a level 4. And boom. That's your example. So think about that. So this is very comprehensive, as you can see, and it can do a lot for your organization in standardizing all of your talent management practices. And people always say, well, you know, why can't we just use basic job descriptions? Because some job descriptions are going to have tasks, some are going to have responsibilities, some are going to have qualifications. And if you just go out and search across your own job postings and then others, you will see the vast inconsistencies across your own and across others. So how can an employee actually, how can we actually assess an employee against a variety of different things? We have to have some level of standardization and normalization. And with that comes a whole host of benefits. So competencies can identify the essential functions of the job that can help with performance planning. It provides information on titles, pay grades, and levels that can help with compensation. We can have a complete understanding of the duties and responsibilities That helps with succession planning and career pathing. It records the acquisition of skills, knowledge, and experience because we're sending those over to our development plan and IDP. Provides that consistency for the job and then future jobs. It helps employees assess for future career paths. It helps recruit candidates and onboard them in the right way. It really provides that level playing field so that everybody's operating on the same information and we stop duplicating job description after job description, changing one or two words. Which leads us to mistake number 2, the identification of talent. Once we have agreement on the roles needed for continued business success, we have to think about people in the organization who might be good candidates to fill the critical roles that we've identified. This process of identifying those people are very biased because we have our own ideas about what is needed to be successful in the role. Each person in the room on your task force is going to bring their own idea. So how can we eliminate bias and drive more objective outcomes? Well, first and foremost, we need to educate our managers on how to remove bias from their own decision making. So let's explore the forms of bias that can and will derail your succession planning process. Cook-Ross published an excellent report entitled Bias in the Performance Management Review Process, which I believe still holds true for succession planning. In that report, they discuss 4 types of bias that I'd like to share with you. Manager bias, self-bias, structural bias, and calibration bias. With a majority of companies doing succession planning using very simplistic processes or plans, you can only imagine the level of bias driving those decisions in the room. To be biased is human nature. However, we know that it's due to our upbringing, it's our culture, socioeconomic norms, and more, but we have to work together to try to eliminate those or at least minimize them. Manager bias, let's start there, has profound influence over decisions. Our decisions as managers are quite frequently made based on input that is all about me sometimes. These biases can be negative or positive. While identifying talent that could be a potential candidate for a succession pool, I see managers do all sorts of things. For example, recommend those for the talent pool that they perceive are more like themselves. They recommend people who do maybe one thing particularly well and disregard the candidate's other skills. Sometimes we call this the halo effect. They might not recommend someone because that person does something well, even though other skills are not top-notch. We call that the horn effect. So as HR leaders and managers, we need to understand these biases and help managers understand the biases as well. So HR or succession pool managers must help managers use tools so that we don't breed one particular personality style that could severely limit the diversity of the talent pool. That is very important. Let's talk about self-rater bias. Employees can also suffer from self-rater bias. If an employee is given lots of general feedback that's very positive, they might believe that they're positive in all skill areas. Or on the flip side, if somebody is given negative feedback for a particular area, they might generalize that and think, well, I'm just not good in any area at all. I'm never going to be able to satisfy anybody. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need to also help employees understand self-rater bias. And here I'm giving you a couple different examples in a couple different areas. Biases about their own career aspirations, about their own family or social biases, kind of some of our working biases that we hold true to our hearts, and global things. And you can create cheat sheets from these that help employees think about their own internal agendas or ideas as they are going through their own self-ratings, so that it's important to help them understand and help us understand how we can bring these together so that we can truly, the goal of doing this is to truly help them understand and better understand learning gaps. So what are some tips to help mitigate manager and self-rater bias? I always say pause, question, and reassess. So during the talent identification phase, create a bias cheat sheet. On the cheat sheet, you can include several key questions to help your employees think critically about why they are recommending certain candidates over other candidates. And you can see here, I'm providing some questions to help you get started. Now, I would expect that you would expand upon these questions within your own environment based on your own culture. But you can use these just as a starting point, and it's really just to bring self-awareness. Let's move on to the third factor, structural bias. This is typically organizational bias. In a great report produced by Catalyst called Cascading Gender Bias, I found just some very interesting information on the way that they look at competencies. One of the studies revealed that organizations, or what they found is that organizations tend to overrepresent masculine characteristics or competencies and underrepresent feminine competencies. And I just found that concept very fascinating. And if you look here, they're color coding these biases or these competencies based on your stereotypical masculine, your stereotypical feminine, and both associated with men or women. And so as I go through here, action-oriented, drives results, problem solving, those are typically more male. And then the yellow being consulting, team building, inspiring, more feminine. Couldn't this bring up some important findings when we're thinking about our assessments? And I would challenge you to review your company's competency model or your specific job role profiles and see how they fare. Are yours more masculine or feminine, or is there a balance? I just think some interesting patterns could occur. Some of the questions that came up from me include, do men rate other men higher on the masculine competencies? Do women rate other women higher on the feminine competencies? Do men rate women better, equally, or lesser than men on masculine competencies? And do women rate men better, equally, or lesser than men on the masculine competencies? I just find these questions interesting, and I'm not a data analyst, but I can imagine that we would find some very interesting results. So use those as a basis to get you thinking about your own competency model. So some tips to mitigate structural bias. During the design of your job role profiles and when identifying potential candidates for the succession pipeline, make your managers aware of the slight differences in competencies so that we can seek to remove or at least drastically reduce gender bias in the process. And the last bias in the Cook-Ross model is calibration bias. They suggest, and I have seen personally, that calibration bias is greatly influenced by three factors. One, whether the candidates are well-known or unknown to other people in the room, how long an employee has been with the company, and the position, typically a high-level person, or personality, it's typically dominant, of the person making the decision or the person who's going to influence a decision, whether they're high level or the dominant person, can have great influence over who gets in that candidate pool. And I've witnessed countless succession management calibration discussions where a CEO or a very strong leader speaks very authoritatively about a particular person who should be in the pool because of X. And X should be leadership skills or communication or the attainment of some result. And no other person in the room agrees, but because they fear a consequence or a backlash, they might be skittishly shaking their head in disagreement. Another scenario might be when an ideal candidate that is not well known amongst the majority of the people in the room is easily pushed aside. Nah, this person should not be in the talent pool. But you know what? Such and such should be in the talent pool because everybody knows them and they're more popular, but they may not be the ideal candidate for the role. So we really need to think about those situations, and we have to think about mitigating those biases. And the only way we can do that is to stick to the characteristics and the criteria qualifiers that you defined earlier in your process. Always try to bring the discussion back to the data and what the group agreed upon by using your cheat sheets to get people thinking about their own intent and their own agendas. And the final mistake that can disrupt your succession planning process is the assessment of key talent. And I just love this picture because it talks to everything that we've discussed to this point. How do we know who the right person is to be in the pool? Now that we've identified our roles and we have a number of employees who could be potential candidates for the succession pipeline. And we don't want people who have just been recommended because somebody thinks it's so. How do we know once we've collected this big group that they are indeed the right potential candidates? How can we help your organization reframe from the handpicked method to something more science-based and repeatable? There is a better way. So up until this point, managers and or your succession task force had to rely on a couple different forms of input really to identify your prospects. This data might include your past performance scores, flight risk, somebody's resume. In their IDP, people might have said, hey, I'm interested in this role. There might have been some great notable result. It might be a loss of impact. So we have this pool. This pool might have been identified for, the VP of sales or one of our hard to fill roles. But how do we know which ones are the right ones? We do that through a competency gap analysis. So once we have the employees who are identified as a potential fit, we need to actually assess them against the actual job role profile. I like to use a 360 assessment tool to gather input from many stakeholders in the company. That being the person assessing themselves, the managers, and people who are able to observe someone in that role. And the questions we're really trying to answer, or what we're trying to get to, are they a fit? What are the primary development needs that we need to look at in order for this person to be ready for the next level? What skills are needed versus what skills are existing? And based on that, who might be ready for promotion now, 9 months, 18 months, 24 months? So when we do this, we're going to get a result and a potential readiness score. And we need to look at those people in that pool and discuss them. Don't just assume they're in the pool. Let's have a discussion in that calibration meeting about whether they are or should be or not be part of the talent pool. Just because they might look ready doesn't necessarily need to be there. And let's agree on their readiness. Let's agree on what should be in their development plan. And in this scenario, I have 3 talent pools, and I've identified the top 3 contenders for those pools. And And you really need to think about, and these three may not just be static. These people could come in and out of this talent pool for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about next. And the thing to keep in mind, it seems like this is a lot of work, and it is a lot of work, but it's absolutely worth it in the long run. Once we have these pools identified, I typically recommend that organizations look at their talent pools on a quarterly basis at a minimum. And in those quarterly follow-ups with your succession team, reports should be shared on who's making progress on their individual development plan and who is not. I truly believe that career development should be self-directed. It is an employee's responsibility, and if they're not taking their development plan seriously, you may have to move them out of the succession pool. In addition, I also believe that managers and/or coaches should meet regularly with employees to help them reach their goals and complete their learning gaps. Complete their learning gaps to objectives to close gaps. Tongue-tied there for a minute. Now, one way to monitor progress is the use of a talent grid, or some people call it a 9-box. And this 9-box is used as a visual cue to indicate or demonstrate both an employee's current performance and his or her potential level within the organization. The 9-box typically demonstrates potential on the vertical and performance on the horizontal axis. And you can see that here. We've got potential and performance. Now, what typically happens is the vertical columns identify an employee's growth. And you have to come up with these names, but we typically use low, medium, and high. So low would be at the bottom, medium, and high. And performance, typically low, medium, and high. Now, in addition to each of the box and having a cue for their level of readiness, each box might have a label defined by the organization to identify the stage of development that relates to the combined score of potential and performance. In this case, you might say ready for advancement immediately or ready for advancement with development. It should go hand in hand with the label you have as the top level box. Now, employees in this upper right-hand corner are typically your highest performers with the highest potential. And in the lower part are your lowest performers with your lowest potential, and then those in the middle. And what we like to see in that situation, in this 9-box grid, is that there is movement. As employees are working on their development plans, we want to see those in the green move to the blue and those in the blue move to the upper right. We also want to see, because this might be an effective person, we want to see them move up. If people in the number 9 aren't moving anywhere in this box, you might have to think about a different strategy for them. They might just come off, or there could be cause for termination. Individual development plans, of course, is that logical next step. That's what our continuous planning is based on. So we need to make sure that everybody is on the same page of what needs to be development, and we find that it's critical in your competency model to have predefined development options that help employee close gaps, so you take the guesswork out of, well, what things do I need to do in order to be ready for the role? This is an example of Talent Guard's competency gap, and in it you can see we have green indicators, we have our general technical qualifications and preferences, and then it's very simple. Green, you're ready; yellow, you're in progress; and red, you are not ready yet. So it gives you a quick sample, and then for each of those, you would have learning resources and or mentors that you can connect with to close those gaps. And then the second question, once we're looking at, is, do we do for each one, and this is what I was saying, your option, should it be a temporary job assignment, a degree program, an external training program, reading a book? There are a variety of things, but let's have them predefined before we move forward, because we don't want to get to this point and the employees not be able to develop themselves because they don't know how to move forward. Now, how do we manage those gaps? Well, as you know, you need an individual development plan. This is just our example of an individual development plan. And you can see here we track progress, the actual description. We have a status, whether they've achieved it or they're working on it or they haven't started. We have feedback from multiple stakeholders across the whole company. In addition, if you want to rate your development options, go ahead, you can do that. That's an option. But it gives the employee and the manager, and if you're using a coach, a dashboard to see where they're at in their level of development. And in addition, like I said, as they're updating here, that automatically updates your talent grid, which is a great thing as you're planning for your meetings with your succession team. That concludes our presentation today. I just want to end with a quick summary, which is to be sure to identify the positions that have business impact to your company and your business agenda. Seek to eliminate bias in the entire assessment and discussion phases all the time, not just once. Use assessment tools and all other employee data to make objective decisions as much as you can, and use that data to find the right candidates for your talent pools. And look at your progress often. Monitor those development plans. And if you do that, you are preparing yourself for the reasons that we set succession planning up for: the business continuity, the financial improvement, and the engagement. A couple final words. Just a little bit about Talent Guard. As I said, we are a full service talent management software company. We have an entire talent management suite, and you can see here in this cloud we have performance, 360-degree feedback, certification tracking, succession planning, development planning, and career pathing. Our entire suite, and we call it competency-based for a reason, is we use all of our job role profiles or our normalized competencies to drive consistency across every talent management process that we touch our hands on, so that your data and your analytics are very powerful. And if you want more information on that, you can obviously go to our website, give us a call, send us an email. Our information is on the website. Something to keep in mind, in September, our upcoming webinar is Destination Unknown. Employees without career paths present a risk to your organization, and I will be publishing more information on that on our upcoming webinars page. And in addition, we have lots of other resources in our library, our Learning Center, under the Succession tab. This is just one of them, how to successfully implement succession planning. And there are many other webinars that can help you to achieve your goal in setting up an effective succession plan. I want to thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions, as I said, feel free to reach out, and have a wonderful day.